Decano, por favor, adelante con la conferencia.
Muy buenas tardes. Quiero darles la bienvenida en nombre de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociología a esta sesión para un debate que yo creo que es central en las ciencias sociales y en la ciencia política, que sin duda ocupa pues, un lugar de reflexión y de una forma muy especial en este momento que estamos viviendo de pandemia. Básicamente, yo creo que eso son unas jornadas que efectivamente centran la reflexión en uno de los temas fundamentales en Europa, pero me atrevería a decir en todo el conjunto del sistema internacional, que no dejan de ser el choque entre los principios de solidaridad, de derechos humanos, y versus el cierre de fronteras y una falsa seguridad, o mejor dicho, el debate permanente que siempre existe entre libertad y esa falsa seguridad. Y evidentemente este debate no deja de ser sino el principal campo en el que se desarrolla pues, el populismo reaccionario y el nacionalismo más radical. Es claro que es un proceso que estamos viviendo en toda Europa, que estamos viviendo en Gran Bretaña, en Francia, en Alemania, en España, en toda la Europa central y oriental, pero que recuerdo que afecta a las tres superpotencias globales. Estamos hablando que efectivamente ese populismo nacionalista más reaccionario es el que tiene Trump en los Estados Unidos, el que tiene Putin en Rusia o el que tiene Xi Jinping en China. Este nacionalismo populista yo diría que es uno de los principales riesgos para los principios de la democracia representativa y me atrevería a decir también que es uno de los principales riesgos para la propia armonía del sistema internacional. Para abrir la reflexión sobre este tema, hoy tenemos a uno de los grandes especialistas mundiales, como es Pippa Norris. Professor Norris, welcome to our university and thank you for you accepting our invitation to give this conference.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presence, especially in this moment full of the complications and limits. It's very important for us to reflect on one of the most important and serious problems that are occurring in Europe and within in the international system. The nationalism that we are suffering in the UK, France, Germany, Spain, and the Central Europe also affect the three global superpowers in the Trump in the United States, Putin and Russia, and Xi Jinping in China. This populist is the main problem for the representative democracy and for the harmony of the international system. Professor Norris, in our Faculty of Political Science and Sociology, you have your home. We look forward to have you again with us for another extraordinary conference in person soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Quiero dar la palabra y dar las gracias también al Instituto Elcano y a su director, Charles Powell. Muchísimas gracias por esta colaboración, que yo creo que es el inicio de una buena amistad y de muchas iniciativas que tenemos por delante. Y por supuesto también dar las gracias a nuestro departamento, el Departamento de Ciencia Política, y a Margarita Gómez-Reino y a Íñigo del Instituto Elcano, que han sido los verdaderos artífices para estar esta tarde aquí. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Charles, tienes la palabra.
Muchas gracias. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be co-hosting this event, which is being broadcast to you live from Madrid, Spain. And as you know, today's session is part of a broader workshop, which is being hosted by UNED and the Elcano Royal Institute on the changing politics of international solidarity in Europe, the politicization of asylum, migration, and aid to third countries, which will be taking place today and tomorrow. This afternoon, we have the great pleasure of having Pippa Norris with us. And as you all know, she is the Paul F. McGuire Professor in Comparative Politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. It's a great honor and pleasure to have you with us, Pippa. Thank you so much. She is going to be talking to us about her latest research on populist challenges to cosmopolitan values in Europe. And after her presentation, I will take some questions from 6 or 7 researchers who have joined us, who are experts in the field, and she will obviously be happy to take questions from them and answer them in due course. Let me just remind you the hashtag, if you are following us and want to express views on Twitter, the hashtag for this event is Populist Cosmopolitan EU. So without further ado, Professor Norris, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join you, even if distantly. And I'd like to thank very much Gustavo Palomares, the Dean of UNED, and of course Charles Powell as well for hosting this. It's a pleasure to be with you. And this is a challenging time for everybody, and it's really an appropriate time to think through populism. What does it mean? How is it challenging cosmopolitan values and values more generally in Europe? And so what I'd like to do is present some of my most recent work on this and to think through the meaning of populism and what it means for the resurgence of nationalism that we can see not just in Europe, but in many countries around the world. So the area that I'm going to focus on is a new paper. And if you can see the screen and you can share the screen, is that okay? You can see the new faculty research paper, and that's a link to it at the Kennedy School. It's about measuring populism worldwide. And again, Charles, if I can just check, I've moved on to the third screen. Is that still good? You can see the slides? Now you've gone quiet for some reason.
Yes, we can
you can see the
perfectly.
Perfectly. Always good to check. Occasionally, I've gone through them with my class. Halfway through, they say, hey, there's no PowerPoint on the slide behind you. And you, okay. So what's this about? Well, partly this is my book on cultural backlash, which I did, of course, with my great colleague, Ron Inglehart at University of Michigan. And we sought to explain populism, but we did that with a theory that I'll come back to. But part of that is really how do we actually understand populist parties? And often in the literature, what you find is that many people assume there's a distinct type of populist party family, rather like there are Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, Conservative parties, Liberal parties, and so on. But it's often called different things. And so we refer back to things called populist radical right. That's very common, for example, the work of Krasmuda, or the far right, or the extreme right, or right-wing populists. There's many different permutations. And so I think when we go globally, we really need to make our concepts much more precise. We need to get our measures much more accurate. And we need to think, are we talking about common ideologies? Are we talking about a set of ideas, as many people assume? Issue positions, so that you can see that they're clearly on the left or the right on particular issues? Or is it a rhetorical discourse? And if we can start to get this more precise, we might start to see there are varieties of populist parties and leaders worldwide, and it's a matter of degree, not a matter of type. I think that's a really important distinction, that any parties can adopt populist rhetoric, and it isn't simply a particular group who we often refer to as the populists. And then the big question, what's the impact of populism on cultural values? And part of this work, by the way, I'm also doing with the European Commission, who will have a new study which they're in the field on with a new Eurobarometer, trying to measure attitudes and values in Europe and how they're changing. So let's start with the concept. Then I'll talk about some of the methods and data, the findings, a little bit on robustness checks, and then the conclusions. How does this tie into the bigger project which is going on in Madrid? First, there are enormous amounts of publications now coming out. This is just some of the most recent books which are out And as you can see, a lot of this has been done in Western Europe, but also increasingly in Eastern and Central Europe as well. And again, you can see from this that we're talking about a variety of different phenomena with different types of labels. We haven't even got the same concept in that. When we're thinking about the leaders, immediately some people come to mind. Marine Le Pen, for example, for the National Assembly in France, obviously a classic, but also others such as Donald Trump now in America, predominating with so much of what's going on. Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, slightly different in a number of different ways to both of those. Viktor Orban in Eastern Europe, Siv Jensen, because this is a phenomenon also there in Scandinavia as well, very strongly. So we're familiar with the leaders, but what do these have in common? Are they all, for example, clearly in favour of conservative or right-wing economic values? Or are they more to the left? There are different arguments about that and the role of the state in terms of market versus the economy. Are they all in favour of nationalism? Yes, that's a common theme, but it takes different forms of expression. And as soon as we go worldwide, many others are also called populists, but they also vary a lot. Nicolas Maduro, for example, taking on the mantle in Venezuela, very different to Bolsonaro in Brazil, but also in the Philippines with Duterte, or in Turkey with Erdogan, or in Egypt with Modi. So a wide range of different leaders and different parties take on this broad mantle. And of course, we also know that it's not simply those who are seen as, quote, right-wing populists. There are many who are progressive or liberals. There are varieties of populists. We can think about Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who are progressives, but also very populist in railing against capitalism, railing against corporations, in favour of redistribution, but also in favour of a variety of other reforms to the system, structural reforms. And of course, in Spain, the movement which is so important, Podemos, and the ways in which that's challenging politics and has a radical change in the party competition. So let's get the concept precise. Now, as I said, there are many different ways to think about it. This, in our book, is the way that we've tried to work it through. So we say it's not a distinct type of leadership. For example, some people in Latin America have said populism is about a charismatic leader. We don't think that's necessarily the case. You can have parties which aren't particularly leadership dominated, just as you can have others, as in, for example, the GOP in America, where the president is highly important for the nature of the party. Nor is it even a family of political parties, as often assumed. Rather, it's a discourse, a form of speech, a rhetoric, which is about persuasion, which leaders use. And what's the discourse about? About governance. And it can be adopted by actors across the entire political spectrum. And again, one can see this if you look at a variety of different countries where populist discourse has really crept into the mainstream. And I give you the example of the Brexit debate in Britain and the way in which the Conservative Party, which was really a party of a small state and a market economy under Margaret Thatcher, has been transformed, first under Theresa May and then under Boris Johnson, into a much more nationalist and populist party. So what's this about? It's not about ideology, because ideology, if you think about a socialism or communism, is about what should be done. It's about a series of programs. It's about where parties should move. Instead, it's about the rightful allocation of governance authority in any society. So it's in some ways a first level phenomena. It's challenging who should rule. It's challenging power, not just about policies. And let's emphasize that the difference I make between Cas Mudde and myself and the ideational school, which he leads, is that it's more about ideas which may be genuine, they may be authentic, but it's more about the words than the actions. And often what you find with populist rhetoric is that the leaders such as Trump and Viktor Orban and Boris Johnson will have a shared rhetoric, but their actions themselves are often the antithesis. They're often upside down. It's the opposite of what they're saying. So what are the ideas? In our book, we say there's only really two at essence. There are many different types, and you can all think about particular examples, and you can think there are many different values that are associated with populism, but at the heart, it's only got two claims. In other words, the first claim is it's anti-establishment, and we're very familiar with that. It's criticizing the legitimate authority of all of those institutions in liberal democracy, whether it's other forms of elected politicians, for example, calling politicians in Congress corrupt, or saying that parties are just there for their own self-interest, everything's partisan. It's the deep state and criticism of government officials and their impartiality. Intellectuals and experts, of course, are part of the criticism. For example, the rejection of scientific authority over COVID, so evident in the United States, so evident in, and dangerously so in Brazil, but also in many other countries. It's the emphasis on criticizing the privileged and the rich, even though in practice they often support large-scale corporations and multinational corporations, criticizing the fake media, and a partisan criticism of the judges. And so what it's saying is that these are institutions which are corrupt, out of touch, ineffective, and essentially not speaking for you, quote unquote. And of course, in some countries where the politicians and the major institutions are deeply corrupt and clientelistic, that's a legitimate claim. So you can imagine how reformers and Democrats can go along with that argument in some ways. But the problem is, of course, if you undermine liberal democracy, what are you going to replace it by? The second claim which is made is really popular sovereignty. So the rhetoric says, okay, elites can't govern effectively. They're not governing in your interest. They're not speaking for you. So rightful political authority is based, as in Rousseau, with popular sovereignty and above all majority rule. Remember, Brexit means Brexit. 52% of the British public voted for leaving the EU. That was the democratic decision, and Parliament was not seen as having a role. Now, in theory, a Democrat could easily say, sure, I agree with that. I valued these ideas that people should have a direct voice, and therefore there should be effective elections, opinion polls are important, referendums, rallies, and so on. The trouble is, in many of those countries where populists have risen to power, is that they don't provide direct channels for the voice of the people. And again, if I give you the quotation from Donald Trump, he says, I speak for you. In the rallies, he has campaign rallies across the country. And what he's saying is not, I'm going to empower the people, I'm going to speak for you. It's a paternalistic assumption. It's the ways in which he will embody their values and criticize established authorities. So it's a powerful rhetoric. It ties into ideas that are widespread in Europe. And of course, for those who believe in democracy, it provides real challenges. Because if you go along with this, in many ways, you have to say what you're doing is going along with our values. The problem is when populism is tied to other types of values. And in particular, populist rhetoric, the language is most risky when it's linked to authoritarian values. And when I talk about authoritarianism, that's often open to confusion because we can think of authoritarian governments, we can think of types of regimes, but I'm going back to the 1950s ideas of what is an authoritarian personality. In our book, we don't refer to personality, but we certainly say there are values which those who are authoritarian hold deeply, are critical to their lives. And the first is us-them, a distinction between us, the group, and other people. And the idea is that we're under threat. And this clearly ties in very strongly to the Madrid conference and the Madrid project, because it's about protecting us against them. Now, the us and them is open. So it's about your group and about behaving as appropriate to your group. And the outsiders are often seen in Europe as immigrants, or they're seen as racial and ethnic minorities, by no means the same thing. Or they're anti-Muslim and Islamophobia, which we've seen rising, or anti-Semitism, which we've also seen, unfortunately, rising in Europe. But it's also against foreigners. In the Brexit situation, for example, it wasn't necessarily about migrants, because migrants have been coming to Britain since the 50s. It wasn't about Indians, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis. It was about people who were French, who were living in London, or Polish, who were working in Britain. So xenophobia is deeply embedded in this us-them. Homophobia is also there if you look at Eastern Europe. And also, of course, it's about misogyny against women. And again, there are many examples of that where women's rights have been pushed back under these forces. Nativism, a priority for those who are part of the country and part of the nation, however that's defined. And all of these things are deeply intolerant and eroding trust. And then lastly, group loyalty. So you're under threat in this value. You're under threat to your group. And so what you need is strongman leaders. So although the rhetoric says we're going to empower you, in practice, what it justifies is executive power. A strongman leader who says, I don't need to have judicial scrutiny. I don't need to have rule of law. I don't need to have a Congress who's going to have oversight. Instead, the strongman leader is going to promise to protect, quote, us, whoever that group is, against others. In Donald Trump's rhetoric right now on the pandemic, for example, it was against China that he's always directing his ire. But of course, the outsiders can be many different types. It can be, for example, Muslims in Europe, or it can be Mexican migrants, or it can be outsiders from Central and Eastern Europe. Doesn't really matter. This is the philosophy, this is the view. Now, all of these are common themes which have been around for years. It's not that authoritarianism is new. What's new is the conjunction between authoritarian values and populism. If you just provide authoritarian values, it's clearly often rejected by many people in the public. But when you link it to these claims about popular sovereignty, then it becomes something which is seen as more morally legitimate, even if the leaders themselves and the parties themselves are simply preaching intolerance, hatred, and lack of trust for other groups. Now, this just is a slide which basically just in one slide encapsulates the whole of our book. I'll just walk you briefly through this and then come back to the core, which is how do we start to measure varieties of populism. So in our book, why do people suddenly feel that authoritarian populism is something they can support? Our argument is basically political sociology 101 from the start. It's about structural changes in society. Europe, but many other post-industrial societies, have been transformed over a long period through generational change, obviously, as young people move in, older people die out. Educational has been a radical transformation in our lifetimes, the proportion of college educated, transformed in terms of roles of sex roles and gender, in terms of gender flexibility, as well as issues of the roles of women, social diversity and ethnic diversity in many of our urban areas and many of our populations, and of course, urbanization. Now, all of that, Ron Inglehart years ago in the 1977 book said would lead to the silent revolution. That's familiar. The argument that it would lead gradually amongst these groups to more socially liberal values. Now, if that's the case, why should authoritarianism be rising, which is opposed to socially liberal values? Our argument is that it's been a gradual process over time. When there was only a small group, if we think back to the 70s, who adhered to these values, and they were young people and they were well educated, they certainly protested, but they were very much a minority. It was 10%, it was 15% of the population who were college educated and the younger generation. What's changed generationally is that the liberal values have expanded. Think about ideas of things like, for example, tolerance of homosexuality or gay rights or marriage equality or women's equality. And as those values have taken over through generational shifts, so that group has expanded. In other words, they've become the 40%, and we argue that they're now at the tipping point of a 50%. As a result, those who have lost out from these changes, the older generation, the less educated, the less affluent, men, those who are the white populations, the rural populations, all of those groups feel that their values are under threat. And a tipping point has triggered the cultural backlash. And you can again think about it in terms of, for example, American demography and the way in which the white population that was predominant in the 1950s is now increasingly going to become the minority. It's already happened in California and it's going to happen across America. And you can see similar transformations, even more rapid, in parts of Europe. Now, that creates a tipping point. In other words, people feel they're under threat, not just because the leaders are telling them that, not just because they read the media, which is anti-immigrant, because they are under threat. Those values which they hold dear, which they grew up with, values of religion, of marriage, of society being cohesive, all of those things are changing. And leaders come in, and this triggers the authoritarian reflex, because the leaders say, we're going to protect traditional values, we're going to protect your own ideas against these elites and against these changes. As you can see, immigration and economic grievances are likely to exacerbate this. And we know how rapidly those have changed. The 2009 economic crisis in Europe, which has transformed unemployment. And then immigration, especially around 2015, with Angela Merkel opening the door and a flood of migrants from Syria and many other countries who have changed the populations. Those things are exacerbating the intolerance, but they're not causing it. Now, in turn, that leads to votes. It's not automatic. Those values require a demand side and a supply side. So the parties realize that there is this group, that they can appeal to these values, and that therefore they can get support. But that depends on the rules of the game. Other parties, do they adopt these values? Do they adopt this language? And then it matters for a variety of things: the civic culture, policy agenda, and liberal democracy, particularly in Europe. European values of cosmopolitanism, of solidarity, of multiculturalism, of tolerance, of democracy. All of those things are under threat. And it's very difficult to see how the new polarization of these values is going to resolve itself. Charles, how am I doing for timing? How would you like me to?
You're doing fine. It's 5 to another 5 minutes or so.
Marvelous. So let's then talk about just the next part, the methods and data. How do we start to classify these parties? And this is important for systematic political science and sociology. You can't talk about these values unless you can tap which parties stand for them. And these are all the different ways that people have tried to classify parties. People have looked at party families. That works for traditional parties. It doesn't work for populists. Nobody calls themselves a populist by and large. And indeed, they often call themselves exactly the opposite. You can classify affiliations where groups join together, and that's increasingly happened with populist parties in Europe, where there's transnational networks. But again, there are more than one, and it's not so obvious as a traditional association like the Socialist International. You can look at leadership speeches. You can look at party platforms, and traditionally we've used things like the Comparative Manifesto project in Berlin, but it's not so good at not looking at policies, but looking at rhetoric or looking at language. You can look at roll call voters or cross-national surveys of party elites. That work is starting to emerge. You can look at surveys of the electorate, and you can look at voters' ideas or attitudes. And again, some new batteries of items are starting to emerge on how we measure populism at the mass level. But that's still a matter which is evolving, and we don't have time series data on those issues. And we can use expert surveys. So expert surveys is the method I've used, and I'd like to introduce you to the new expert survey which I've introduced to measure populism. Previous work has done this since the 1980s. Chapel Hill is the most well-known version, but most of the traditional surveys haven't managed to measure populism. So I created a new global party survey, GPS. It's an international survey worldwide. It has 1,800 experts. It covers over 1,000 parties in 163 countries. And it has to be said, nobody has attempted it on such a scale in the past. We've looked at Europe in great detail. We're starting to look at Latin America, but we really haven't started to look at other regions around the world, whether it's in Asia or in Sub-Saharan Africa or in MENA, etc. It has 21 scaled measures, which are 10-point scales, and it seeks to measure key ideological values, as well as a limited number of issue position, but it does include immigration, and it does include nationalism, and then populist rhetoric. And you can use this in a variety of ways, and it basically has a number of different features, and you can download the data set. So these are some of the questions which are part of this, and just gives you an example. We have ideological values classically on the left, right. Where do you place parties on a 10-point scale? Social liberalism and conservatism, and populist rhetoric. And then we also ask on 10-point scales, which are very similar, where do you place the parties on, for example, welcoming diversity or wanting restrictions on immigration, tax and spend, environmentalism, nationalism, and so on. This is the sort of question that we asked our experts on economic issues in particular. Where would you place parties? And in every country, it gets populated by the parties which are in that country in the last election. So this is the question we asked for populism. And again, populist scholars always take up on this. Is this actually accurate? We asked, if you're the expert, this: parties can be classified by the use of populist or pluralist rhetoric. Populist language challenges the legitimacy of established political institutions and emphasizes the will of the people. In other words, we define the measure according to our concept. By contrast, pluralist rhetoric rejects these ideas, believes elected leaders, parliaments, and presidents who are elected should govern constrained by minority rights, bargaining and compromise, checks and balances. Where would you place each party? Whether you're talking about socialist parties, communist parties, Christian democratic parties, populist parties, and so on. So we ask it of every party. We cover the world. And our party competition predicts that parties are going to be placed on, in particular, left and right on the economy, the classic cleavage in Europe, which has been around since the 1950s. But increasingly, that cleavage has become less salient, less important, as the vertical cleavage between conservative social values on issues of marriage and family and women, on issues of cosmopolitan and nationalism, on issues of tolerance of minorities, all of those values versus liberals who believe the opposite. And we therefore predict that we're going to get four basic types of populist parties. Classically, we're going to get the conventional types. On the one hand, those who are conservative in their social values and wanting a small state on the economy. That means that's the group that's now known as the radical right. By contrast, we're going to get those who are consistently wanting to have a larger role for the state, for example, on welfare policies, and more liberal social values. That's the liberal left. But worldwide, we think that's too restricted. And in addition, we should be able to observe groups who are on the left on the economy, but who are very conservative, ultra-conservative on their social values. And I'm going to predict that these are very common in, for example, Central and Eastern Europe. Post-communist countries have a lot of this, such as Viktor Orban. And you also have free market libertarians who are in favour of a small state and liberal social values. Not many of those, but there are some as well. How do we start to apply this? What's our findings? I'll give you a couple of slides and then we'll break off for Q&A. First, if you can see the picture, what we've got is little thumbnails in which I've put all the different countries across OECD, the affluent post-industrial societies. And as you can see, we have some which I've highlighted just to illustrate. So Spain is there. Vox emerges as one of the most consistently in the corner, which is the top right hand. That's to say, the horizontal image, the horizontal axis is whether you're left or right on economic issues, and the vertical is whether you're conservative or liberal on your social values. And you can see that the parties in Spain quite nicely go straight down. And of course, at the other side, we have Podemos, which is, for me, the classic progressive populists, or populists who are in favour of liberal social values and a more left-wing position as well. And you can see that, for example, in Switzerland, you get a similar pattern. In the United States, tremendous polarization. The GOP moving up and moving towards a more conservative social values under Donald Trump, but also it's been moving there since basically around 2000, 2010. It's not just the president who's caused that. And then the Democrats who are down in the liberal left position. But you can immediately start to see that some countries don't follow this pattern at all. So Italy, yes, that works quite nicely. The United Kingdom, yes, it works quite nicely. Germany, pretty good. Australia, pretty good, but not necessarily in Hungary. Whereas you can see Fidesz and Jobbik are actually on the left, not on the classical right, even though they're populist and even though they're conservative. Slovakia is different. Slovenia is different. So what we can see is that, that the party competition is more complex than you might assume from Western Europe. This also shows that it's not simply about the position of parties, but it also nicely predicts the position of voters. So what we've got here is a comparison. On the vertical axis, what I've got is the distance of the parties from the median voter on the liberal conservative scale, and the horizontal axis is the distance of the party from the median voter. And here I'm bringing in the World Value Survey, where we have similar items to measure. And again, you can see that it's pretty well done, a pretty straight line across the axis in Spain. It predicts it quite well, but far more complex in a number of other countries where parties are more complicated and there's party competition is four-dimensional, not just two-dimensional. So to conclude, I'll give you two more slides and then hand over to Charles. Here's the pattern in liberal democracies, not just Europe, but across a wide range of different countries which have, according to VDEM, countries with a good set of liberal democratic institutions. The position in 2019, and what you can see is where the parties are. The populists are the ones which are in red or in, and The pluralists are in green, so you can see where they're located, and you can see what their values are, whether they're on the left or right, whether they're socially liberal or socially conservative. And I've highlighted the United States to show the tremendous amount of polarization, even in a majoritarian electoral system, between the US, the Republican Party, which is very authoritarian and very conservative right now. And remember, this was the party that used to be under Nixon, pretty liberal on many of these sorts of issues, but has steadily moved further towards that direction and is now as authoritarian and conservative as the Swiss People's Party, for example, or Likud in Israel, or many other parties which are around that particular quadrant. And Vox comes out as the most authoritarian and conservative. Now, I don't know if that was an exaggeration. I'll leave that to you to think about, but certainly they seem to be a very extreme version of exactly this type. And then on the progressive left, we see again many different parties with many different values, many different ideologies, many mainstream social democratic parties, Labour parties, liberal parties are clustered into that corner as well. So in liberal democracies, we see only a few cases, although there are some important cases that don't conform. I'll just highlight the Danish People's Party, for example, strongly pro-welfare, because it's in Scandinavia, pretty liberal on the economy, and yet very conservative in its values towards, for example, Christianity. The Czech Freedom and Direct Democracy Party, a centre party. And then we also see a few outliers here of other parties who are libertarian in their social values, but also pro-market. If, however, and this is the last slide, we look at it across a broader range of countries, what you can immediately see is parties are not on that diagonal line. According to this, we get populist parties who are clearly nativist socialist, as we term them. Parties like Law and Justice in Poland, who are very nativist in their immigration policies, who want to protect Poles from outside forces, anti-EU, although not as explicitly anti-EU as they have been in the past, but nevertheless pushing back on many EU standard multicultural and cosmopolitan values. Hungary, Fidesz, clearly there, but also a number of other parties that you can see, but particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, in Lithuania, in Romania and Bulgaria, many parties who fall into that category. And in the free market libertarians, you can also see that there are diverse parties who again fall into that from different countries. Now, I'm not an expert on all of these parties, but I really think that we need to broaden our comparison beyond Europe, because Europe is not typical of party competition around the world. And this new data set, which is available to every single researcher, can be downloaded. It was released in February. It's already had over 2,000 downloads. Can be used to classify parties. And the great thing about the data set is also that it already has codes in it. So if you're working on mass public opinion, for example, you're using the Eurobarometer, you're using the European Social Survey, you're using cross-national data like the World Values Survey, the codes can be easily merged. So the research agenda can really say, what's the ways in which these parties are tapping into the values of the electorate? Are they consistent? And what are the aspects about these parties that people find electoral appealing, in order to actually systematically start to understand what's causing the support for these parties. So, Charles, I'll finish there, and I won't go into all the robustness tests. They're all available.
Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. This Global Party Survey is an absolute treasure trove, and I'm sure that you'll have a lot of people visiting it in the next few hours and days. And of course, all of this is fascinating for those of us who work on European issues and international issues, because of course, populism is not only having an impact on our domestic party political policies, but also, of course, on the development of European integration and the rising threats to multilateralism. Okay, so the floor is now open to our researchers, who I'm sure have questions for you. I see Juan Diaz-Nicolas on my screen. Juan, would you like to go first? You have to unmute your microphone. Thank you, Juan. Lovely to see you.
Okay, thank you very much, Charles, and hello, Pippa. Very clear lecture. And I have just two questions because there are many people who want to intervene. The first question refers to the division you make between authoritarian and libertarian. And I don't know whether actually that hides a kind of a classification. All classifications are absolutely a kind of arbitrary. So I will not discuss that, but it seems that authoritarian refers to right parties, while libertarian refers to left parties. Now, wouldn't you agree that there are leftist parties that are also authoritarian?
Yes.
Because in the book, you didn't mention it in your talk, but you put Maduro as one authoritarian. He's certainly not right, as I can figure. But then in the libertarian, there are some that I would consider them as kind of authoritarian leaders. I mean, Trump is very authoritarian, but he is with the Constitution, isn't he? Even, I mean, I disagree profoundly, and I don't have to argue because I know. But being authoritarian is something, and having an authoritarian system is different.
That's right.
That would be my question. The second question has to do with the cause and effect between populism and values. Mm. And I am pretty sure that we will agree on that. I think the change in values came before populism. Mm-hmm. That is, as you probably, I don't remember when you joined the WBS, but I think, I mean, the data of the 2000 wave already showed, and both Chris Belsall and myself pointed out that there was a slight change on the post-materialism. That is, people, especially in more developed countries, were beginning to be more oriented towards materialism rather. I mean, there was a kind of backlash at that time, precisely. And that has been confirmed in the 2005 wave and in the 2010, and now in the 2017. So the change in values towards more materialistic, which is more security, and more authoritarian, and more authority, there is a question that you know, do you want more authority in the future? Well, there was a change towards authoritarian and materialistic values since 2000, and populist movements came after the first crisis of 2007-2008. That is when it started in Greece and in many other countries. Then the so-called Arab Spring, which no Arab calls Arab Spring. It is a Western title we have given them. So don't you think that populism came because the road was already paved for that kind of change that was due mainly to the growing inequalities everywhere in the world? Thank you.
Charles, would you like more questions?
Let me take a few more, Pippa, if I may. Can I ask Marga Gómez-Reino to jump in at this point? Thank you. And perhaps if I can ask you all to keep your questions brief. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, I will, I think, a well-deserved congratulations on your book, Pippa, with your book with Ronald. It is indeed a great contribution to the comparative literature, particularly on our efforts to provide kind of ground theory to populism. And there are many of us that still work with middle range frameworks. So it's really, in that sense, I think it's a great a great work. So I'd like to ask you not about the book, but about the HSK working paper. I think your GPS project, which I absolutely think is the way to go. We see that, at least I feel that there are some similarities, or more similarities than in the past, with concepts and measures that are also used by other researchers, such as Kirk Hawkins and his team Populism. So I'll restrain myself to just that question. Thank you.
Perhaps I can ask Aitor to jump in with his question.
You, Charles.
And then we can ask Pippa to reply. Thank you, Aitor. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Pippa, for the lecture, for the book, and for the Global Party Survey project. My question is on categories. I see that, I refer now to the book. I see that you define authoritarian parties in terms of 7 defining features, drawing on this Chapel Hill expert survey, and 4 of them refer to the nationalist cosmopolitan cleavage. So my question would be, why authoritarian populist parties? Why not anti-cosmopolitan populist parties?
Right, right.
And my second question is about some trends in Europe. There is indeed some negative trends in certain indicators that relate to international solidarity policies, such as the ODA-GNI ratio, the share of asylum applications accepted, etc. And there is also a growing number of governments that depend on national populist support. However, we find no link between both phenomena. So can you refer to how populists fail or succeed to actually influence the policy agenda, please?
Right. Yes, those are all really good questions. So let me start with Andy, who obviously a very old colleague and old friend of ours from World Value Survey. We've worked together for many, many years, and very, very marvelous in leading a lot of the public opinion work in Spain. So absolutely, we do argue that the left can be just as authoritarian as the right in terms of you can see that there are certain groups and parties who stand for pro-state. They want to have a large expense on the public sector. They want to have a large-scale protectionism. Trump, for example, is not a classical neoliberal in terms of Reagan. He wants to have enormous amounts of money being spent on trade protection against China, against Europe, against everybody. His favorite word is tariffs, basically. So what our basic point is that we have these new cleavages. The old 1950s cleavage was a class cleavage which was based on left, right, by and large, familiar. Everybody in Europe knows that one. Didn't necessarily work in many developing countries, but it was a familiar division. And what we see since the 1980s is the new cleavage, which we can call different things. And Ato is quite right. How do we label it? How do we conceptualize it is really important. But it's the other division which is going on, which is about social, moral, and international values as well. And so clearly you can have authoritarians in terms of our classical concepts and social conservatives who are on the left in the economy or on the right. And you can think of many examples. And this is precisely why I argue that our old labels of radical right, which I used to use myself. I even have a book on which I called Radical Right, which was years old. But that was kind of thinking about it in the 1980s and 1990s. Nowadays, that concept doesn't work. And the trouble, a large part of the problems with political science is we're dragging in concepts from the 1950s and 60s, and we still use them because they're familiar. We can talk to each other. We can label each other. We know what we're talking about. When you get a new phenomena hitting us, you've got to both put it in historical context, but also rethink some of the intellectual basis and then our measurements as well. So yes, of course, you can have authoritarianism in our values on the left and on the right. Cause and effect. So we think of it as interaction. We think that you have both supply and demand. So, and that's within an institutional set of players. So we know that these parties have been around in the 50s. There was a whole bunch of neo-Nazi fascist parties in Germany, for example, which were suppressed. There were a whole bunch of parties in the 1970s. Think about the British National Party and the National Front then, which was started by her father, Le Pen, in the 1970s. So these parties aren't new. What's changed is, in some ways, that you have to have both the parties articulating these values, and then you have to have changes in the populace that thinks that these are acceptable values to go mainstream. And that's what's changed. So we are sociologists, we are political sociologists. And that's why in our model that we have in the book, we start with the demographic social changes, which then leads to the value changes, which then leads to the support for the political parties within a set of rules, etc. But on the other hand, if there's no party or leader who's going to exemplify those values, then you can have pent-up demand without necessarily having political support. And again, I think it's fascinating to think about the evolution of parties when one thinks about the Republican Party in America in around 2000. Bush was really kind of a traditional Republican. He was liberal on migration. He rather liked open migration because it meant cheap labor. That was a basic concept. The party changed first because of the Tea Party, which emerged as a kind of breakaway faction, then the Freedom Group in the Congress. And then gradually what's happened is that the moderates have left the party in Congress and the leadership, and those with more conservative values have taken over. And then Trump comes along to articulate that and breaks through. So I think one cannot underestimate the contingency factor when it comes to parties and leaders. Things happen you can't necessarily predict. The fact that, for example, Johnson took over from May was an unpredictable. The fact that Brexit came out one way versus another was somewhat unpredictable. But long-term social changes are like a wave that's going on, and then the leaders and the parties take advantage of those and can tap into that. So we have to have supply and demand to actually explain what's going on. But you also can't assume that things only started in like 2007 rather than like sex started in 1960 with the Beatles. These values have been in society for years. Political disaffection is nothing new. We know that. It's exemplified by Mediterranean Europe. Lack of trust has been a long-term trend. So it's when the popular demands in the public through the World Value Survey and others meets, and the leaders themselves are willing to adopt those values and articulate those values and exemplify and strengthen those values, that's when you get the rise of these kind of forces. Let me go on to the last two other questions here. GPS, is our work similar to Hawkins? Well, it is, absolutely, because after all, we're building on all the other people who are working on populism. We're not standing alone. Hawkins himself has a very interesting study where he tries to look at the leadership rhetoric by taking 2 speeches from about 40 leaders around the world and then coding them and classifying them, which is great. Problem is that you've got real problems with language. If I read a speech in Spanish and you read a speech in Spanish, are we going to understand the same connotations? Might I think it's populist and you won't? And that complicates matters as soon as you go worldwide. Secondly, leadership speeches may not be typical of the party. So in many countries, think about the AfD in Germany, for example, they're kind of leader lists in a way. It's not really the leaders themselves, it's a mass party. You can think of many others where you have a variety of different groups within a party. So our expert survey tries to classify party as a collective. How much do they use this rhetoric? And we think, therefore, we can build on the work on rhetoric, which has been developed very, very valuably by Hawkins and others. But we also do not accept that it's a set of ideas. The ideational approach, which motivates team populism, says that it's a set of very simple ideas, and they basically argue that the ideas are what's in common. By calling them ideas, you're calling them attitudes. We just don't know if those attitudes are genuine or not. What I feel quite strongly is that with the leaders, those ideas are often false. They're a facade. They're a way of getting support. They're a way of tapping into popular disaffection. They're a way of claiming that I'm going to speak for you, the populace. In practice, they're doing exactly the opposite and consolidating power in their own hands. So it's a dangerous facade, and we need to not just take their words at face value, but take it critically. And the last point, Cosmopolitan, we thought about this, Eta. And at first we talked about liberal cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitan liberals. We used a variety of different concepts to try and capture this. We ended up with the authoritarian label because of the 1950s literature in social psychology. but I must admit that it really causes problems and barriers, because a large number of people, whenever I say authoritarian, they don't think of the work of Fromm, they don't think of social psychology, they think of regime. And therefore, authoritarian values, which is what we're trying to emphasize, are understood by lots of people as authoritarian institutions. But we've tried to tap into authoritarianism as a concept of populism and a set of values, i.e. priorities. And the last question is, how far do they influence policies? Well, there's an enormous literature, obviously, on that, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. Clearly, on immigration, they've had a big impact. One can think of things like Angela Merkel's policies. 2015, she opened the state. By 2016, there was so much pushback that she immediately had much more constrained measures. And you can think of cases like the Swedish Democrats. You can think of other cases of liberal societies which have really reacted. On the other hand, part of this is they're reacting to changes in society. They are changing in public opinion. It's not simply the party which is articulating this value, it's the public which is becoming more nationalistic and is becoming more restrictive on nativism and things like that. So it's very difficult to disentangle the actual role of parties and party leaders and their rhetoric compared with all the other social changes. And that can mean that we inflate the impact of the leader versus everything else that's going on in that particular society. Without those parties, would we have had certain policy changes? I can give you a number of examples where you can clearly say no. If there hadn't been UKIP in Britain, would there have been Brexit? And the answer for me is no. So that has to be high politics. It has to be Nigel Farage. If Johnson hadn't joined with the Leave campaign, would there have been Brexit? Because it was so tight, the answer is no. So contingent factors, top leaders, parties, obviously make a difference. But as Juan said, unless they have a mass support, unless they can tap into genuine feelings in the electorate, then they're not going to be able to get victory and they're not going to get power. So it's an interactive model you need. And unfortunately, the last word, Charles, in political science, you often have people who work on parties but don't work on public opinion. You have people who work on public opinion but don't work on parties. We're sitting at separate tables. People work on leadership and people work, and you always want to reify the things you're working on. People who are working on the media love to say how important the media is, etc. Because after all, that kind of justifies your research agenda. But what you really need is a more synoptic, a general theory, which can account for a variety of different forces. And then, of course, multi-level analysis and more data sets. For example, we haven't even started to look at the populism in the media. We realise it's there, but nobody's started to measure that in an interesting way. We haven't really looked at populism in social movements. So there's an enormous agenda which is starting to be caught up. The amount of work on populism is going up exponentially, rather like the pandemic. But I think we're getting a grasp on the impact on policy. And we can certainly say the other thing is it's not simply a populist party having an impact on policy, but when the party itself is, when there's rhetoric is taken up by the mainstream parties. And so you can obviously have either parroting, where they take up the words and the actions to some extent, or you can have exclusion, and you try to keep the parties out of power. And I think that these populist values are a matter of degree, and that's what we start to measure. So many parties have become more populist, even though they're traditional parties which have been around in Europe or in other countries for decades. But they start to take on the same values.
Thank you very much. Let me bring in two more of our colleagues, Hans-Jörg Trent, who's following us from Stockholm, and Carmen González Enriquez. Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm in Berlin, actually, not in
I'm
Stockholm.
sorry. I'm sorry.
Thanks to Pippa for the very inspiring talk. It was incredibly rich, very instructive. And I would like to discuss a little bit the notion of populism as a discourse, which I understand you develop as a kind of lowest common denominator notion, and you argue against the ideational school, which discusses populism as an ideology. So I can see that populism is not an ideology, but how can it be that it is a discourse? And what you say is that it is a discourse that is best understood by its antithesis. So it is a discourse that argues against pluralism. And here I have a question. which is that if populism is a discourse that is anti-plural, how is it that populism itself is so very diffuse, that it is so contradictory in itself? Yes. In fact, populism is often found to be very plural and diverse internally. So it's a discourse, but then it also needs to address audiences, but also audiences are extremely diverse, plural. So there is this plurality also of those who follow populist leaders. And there is actually no constituency. There are only very diverse, very shifting groups of people who one day follow, the next day they don't follow. There is no audience that could be addressed by a single and coherent discourse. And I can see that there are these that there are all these empty slogans that are used by the populist leaders, but what turns them into a discourse? And related to this, I would also like to raise again the question of how anti-authoritarianism and anti-pluralism fits together, because also here sometimes there seems to be a contradiction. And what I have in mind here is something I witness in Berlin these days quite a lot, which are these post-truth populism manifestations. So you have people manifesting in the streets against the corona lockouts, and they do this by being anti-authoritarian. So they kind of challenge the authority of the science and of experts, but often they do this in the name of pluralism. So these climate change deniers also, and also these corona freedom fighters, they often call for alternative opinions to be heard, to be taken seriously with their what they call diverse opinions. They often see themselves as minorities that are not heard and that need to be included in a real democratic process. So they often combine their anti-authoritarianism with calls for more plurality, to enhance pluralism. So how does this all fit together?
Good question.
Can I? Thank you. This reminds me of your colleague Jan Werner Müller. No, he basically argues that the essence is anti-pluralism. Carmen González, if you are still there, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you very much, Pippa Norris, for your very interesting presentation. Just in case some of our viewers is not familiarized with your work, I would like to summarize very quickly one of the main arguments of your last book with Ronald Inglehart, where you have well established that there is a clear relationship between the so-called silent cultural revolution and the rise of a populist movement against this revolution. This revolution entailed a change on values, and while public attention was drawing away from materialist concerns, from economy and welfare state. And in the present context, in the context of the pandemic right now, I was wondering if you had time to think about which kind of impact this pandemic, and more than the pandemic, the economic crisis which this pandemic is provoking everywhere, which kind of impact this pandemic could have on the social values, in the mainstream social values, because I fear that I think there is a great risk of a coming back, of a return to materialist values, to even to nationalism, and even to anti-globalization positions. So I would like to know which one is your bet on this, your intuition on this issue. Thank you.
Charles, would you like me?
Please,
okay,
yes.
Thank you. So again, really good questions that we've got here, and comments and thoughts. So let's think about Hans-Jörg's question about discourse. Is this a discourse? Well, I've been having a long conversation about this with colleagues in the Team Populist and others who say, no, it's a set of ideas. And I've been trying to work out where we differ from each other. And the basic idea for them is that we share the idea, we share the commonality of what the kind of core components are. We both agree it's about an anti-elite or anti-establishment theme. That's one aspect, obviously very critical of established powers and established governments and established authorities. And then the other one is that somehow it's about being for the people or popular sovereignty. It's a question about the meaning of those ideas and whether or not they're genuine and authentic, or whether or not they're false and a facade in order to basically increase the power of the executive and those who are trying to stamp out pluralism. And the ideational approach essentially takes them seriously. And colleagues have said, look, we can't tell what the motivation of leaders is when they use this discourse. Maybe they are being more democratic and they're in favor of direct deliberative democracy, or they're in favor of direct forms of democracy. And to some extent, some populists certainly are, if we think about the role of referendum, for example, or the claims in the Brexit referendum that the people have spoken and therefore we need to listen to the people. On the other hand, I also watch every day the Trump phenomena, and it's very much influenced my thinking, where I see him saying all the time, fake news, partisan judges, partisan Democrats, and the intolerance, the lack of rule of law, the threats which are there to freedom of speech are so fundamental in one of the world's oldest democracies that I can't help thinking that the discourse which he's using is one which is about his rhetoric to get support. And his values are not about empowering the people in any shape or form. Popular sovereignty is not what it's about. It's about delivering to his own supporters and maintaining his position of support using clientelism, cronyism, corruption, and a variety of other mechanisms in order to advance his own interests. So if it's not ideas and it's not ideology, rhetoric and discourse seems to be the most common thing. And it's a discourse which can be useful because, after all, we know that democratic values are widespread, but this is appealing to democracy to undermine democracy. That's the essential part of what this rhetoric is about. And all the leaders are using it, and many other leaders and parties are using it as well. So it's a powerful rhetoric, it's a persuasive rhetoric in the current situation where we feel worries about the quality of our democracy. We don't think it's working, all of us, and yet this is not the solution, it's the problem. It's exacerbating the problem rather than ameliorating the problem. Can the groups, can the populist movements, those, for example, who are against the lockout, can they claim diversity? They can. On the other hand, we can look at their support and we can see there are certain social sectors are very much in favour of them. And so we can see it's largely the older populations, not the younger. We can see that it's largely those who are white, not the minority populations. We can see it's often rural or semi-rural versus urban. So there are certain cleavages in society which really can predict who's going to support these parties and these leaders. Do they vary from one country to another? Of course, because of course, like any other party, there are shifting coalitions, but nevertheless, you can clearly see that there is a predictable view on who's going to support these particular categories. And it's in America, it's the older white rural men who are predominantly the supporters, the Trump base, as we call them. And that hasn't changed. They've become more intense and more polarized. And those who are against them are equally clear. And they are the cosmopolitan, younger, urban, educated, college educated. It's the old 1970s cleavage, but made so much bigger and so much more political than it was in the 70s and 80s. Although, of course, that had its politics and its demonstrations as well. And Carmen, the question about the pandemic is an interesting one. And I'm having a Harvard workshop, which we've postponed probably till spring, which is going to be on populism, performance and pandemics. And we're trying to think through the way that this might work. And obviously with the events still playing out politically, socially, and with the actual virus spread, we can't tell immediately. And I'm very cautious about making any clear-cut conclusions. But what you can clearly see is it's a double-edged sword. In other words, the immense decrease of security that everybody's feeling. Those who are directly affected by the pandemic, the elderly population, for example, living in care homes, those who are just locked down and not able to get out to work, and then the economic ramifications for those who are least well off. Those are going to be ones which should predict that in fact, populists increase their support, that people want a strong leader. And so there's those movements going on. Economic insecurity and a broader sense of insecurity should both fuel materialism, but also basically fuel these parties because that's their support. On the other hand, there's a second element, which is performance. And one can look at the performance of many of these leaders when they're in power, and it's been disastrous. I mean, the worst case is Bolsonaro in Brazil, and the chaos and anarchy of his policy, and the disintegration of his government, and the spread of the epidemic. If anybody links populism with the performance of populists and their denial of science, the opening up of America, which is going on right now, despite the fact that our cases are plateauing, they're not going down. And particularly those groups who've been affected by the pandemic, when they judge the performance, it's actually his own supporters that Trump is hurting, which is really ironic in many ways. So you've got insecurity should be increasing support for populism. Performance should in many cases be decreasing it. And by the way, the incompetence of these governments can be included in Britain. The worst case, I believe, right now in terms of deaths in Europe, going too little too late, disregarding the science. And then there's a third element, which is policy. Policy is about increasing the restrictions on the public and the role of the police and the role of the security forces and the lockdown and the way it's been enforced. And that might, again, in the long term, be very problematic and could increase authoritarianism, even though there's a reaction against that. So I think you've got counter currents going on with the pandemic. And because we're in the middle of it, we're in the early stages, actually, we're not even in the middle. Because we don't know how it's going to go down in many countries, we don't know what the long-term consequences. Nobody does. I mean, the commentators will speculate about it, but we just don't know. So the jury is still out on that, but it's certainly an enormous agenda, which hopefully we can address by spring, when we'll have a Harvard conference bringing people from all over the world to think about these kind of three elements.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time, but I'm going to ask Hugo Marcos and Sandra Bermudez to put their questions to you. Pippa, very, very briefly, please. Hugo first and then Sandra. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to say congratulations, Pippa, for this phenomenal data collection effort you have done, and also thanks for this wonderful presentation. I have a theoretical question and one question about the results. My theoretical question has to do with the causal chain going from the change in values till the success of populist parties. And I was wondering, I see that there is a structural change that has to do a lot with education, with urbanization, with immigration, that opens society in a way, and then it comes this cultural backlash. But I was not sure about the extent to which the same values that can explain authoritarianism can also explain populism. I would like you to delve into the idea. I mean, what are the specific contents of this cultural backlash that make people resonate stronger with anti-elitist and popular sovereignty elements? And then I have this methodological question, I would say, and I was wondering whether it is really good news that the populism index you have correlates strongly with other measurements you propose, because these other measures were not meant to measure populism, or some of them, some related concepts, but not populism itself. And since populism is negatively charged in a way, the word populism, there is a normative bias against populism. I was wondering whether the experts are taking into account the same definition you give before the scales.
Right.
And I was even wondering if you could make some kind of an experiment, since this is going so big and so comparative, like not giving the definition to the experts and seeing if they still give the same measures to the parties. Because if that's the case, I would say what they are actually measuring to some extent is the distance, their personal distance, or the degree they dislike these parties. If everything works after that, then there is nothing there, and it's still all going good. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Sandra Bermudez.
Yes. Hello. Thanks again, Pippa, for the wonderful presentation and sharing with us your thoughts and your future research on populism. I think it's necessary a work like you that try just to unify and try to find out what is populism and measuring, because reading different studies on populism, I mean, you have a mix of definitions, and it's good that we can find a comparative work that provides us a comparative research and try to measure populism. My question is much more regarding practical politics. You mentioned that these parties usually the discourse is one thing, and then when they are in government and when they are trying to implement their speech, I mean, the practice is a bit different. Also, I am thinking about the political competition. So when is easier that discourse and the policy matches for these parties, and when it's not? Because I have the feeling also that party competition is quite important in trying just to stop or to prevent the policies to emerge, or at least to the discourse to drag on the political competition and the remaining political parties. So my idea is, my question is, under what conditions this discourse and policies merges, and when political competition the remaining parties drag on these kind of discourses and practices. Thanks.
Right. So quickly, because I know we're running out of time, Hugo, absolutely, there are real questions about what's predicting authoritarianism and what's predicting populism in the public, and they're not the same thing. So populism is something which is really about, and again, we don't have perfect measures because as you know, in the electorate, we're starting to evolve with some new measures. Ackerman has developed some. The British election study has included some. I hope we'll include some in the next World Value Survey. But we've got some measures certainly about anti-elitism or anti-establishment, i.e., do you have much confidence in Parliament? Do you have much confidence in the press, the government, etc.? We can kind of use those as a proxy. And then for authoritarianism, we've got quite a lot of good measures about social conservatism that we can use. And certainly the demographics aren't the same necessarily. And again, our book goes into that in some detail. It's the authoritarianism which we think is the heart of the appeal for many of those who are voting for populist parties. That's the strongest predictor. Socially conservative values are the ones which predict whether or not people are voting. The populism kind of cuts across that, and it's much less, it's more diffuse, shall we say. Political trust, for example, isn't that well predicted by most of the demographics that you look at. You might think it's amongst those who are, for example, less equal, or the working class, or the blue-collar workers, or whatever. Not so. I mean, there's a lot of dissatisfaction which kind of cuts across. Social values and social conservatism versus liberal values, that's the one that we think is driving a lot of the mass support. And then in terms of methods, yes, the way I put it is that it's rather like art. We don't necessarily know how to define it, but when we look at it, we kind of know what it is. So is it the case that our measures correlate with others? Yes. And there's a new survey which has been done by another set of colleagues, which is coming out in Comparative Political Studies this month or next, called POPPER, which also tries to measure it through the ideational. And what we find is that their measures and our measures are more or less a beautiful correlation. There's a few outliers, not that many. So it seems that when you ask experts about populism through ideas or populism through our measure, we're getting at the same thing. Is this, however, a reflection of their own values? Well, we can test that. That's an empirical question. So we ask people in the survey for the experts about where they place themselves on various values. And we also ask 5 other questions about populism in the GPS survey. So if you prefer to use any of those single items, you can do so to see if our results are robust or whether or not your definition would produce a different outcome. And one of the reasons why I was really wanting to get that data set out so fast, we did the survey in December and we got it out by February, was that we know that so many people want to be able to measure populism in their country. So many people want to be able to compare populist parties around the world or in a region, Latin America, whatever. So I wanted to clean it, get our measures properly codified and all that sort of stuff. So we've got typologies as well as continuous measures, merge it with various other data sets, and then let everybody use it. It's like 1,000 users can find out, is this a good measure or not? And as people do, I've had a couple of papers back already, and we've got ideas for improvements. And I might well do this again. I might repeat the survey in the end of the year or early next year just to see if there's consistency over time, or if some parties become more populist, others have next. Expert surveys are being used all the time. Often there's no standards. We have a large sample, which we've already identified. So if we repeat it, and we can add new questions, one of which can be, how do you feel about populism? Do you like it, dislike it, on a 10-point scale or something like that? We can test these sorts of empirical measures. But the more you use it, the more other people use it, the more that we merge it with other data sets. And for example, in the World Value Survey, when it becomes released, which should be, the first release comes in July, that's going to have our measures of party populism already embedded in the survey of the electorate. So you can look at the attitudes of the voters, and you can look at the party positions for the first time in the World Value Survey in a consistent way. It's going to make electoral studies really use the World Value Survey in new ways, which are going to be great. Party competition. What do we know about whether other parties parrot or act or treat these parties as pariahs? That, I think, is still an evolving question, which we're learning as more parties get into power and as they perform in different ways. My own view is that essentially populism is a matter of degree. Authoritarianism is a matter of degree, it's not a type. And therefore we can see that parties can both become more populist over time and less populist over time, more authoritarian, less, just like they become more or less left-wing or right-wing. I mean, it's not a single category at all. And the more we can understand degrees, the more we can really start to understand in Spain, for example, when Vox managed to get greater support and Podemos as well, how did the other parties respond? And you need specific cases of countries where parties have moved up or down, Germany, Italy, Spain, France, and then we can start to understand the dynamics, but it's going to take some time to really get a handle on that, I feel. And most of the work has been done on immigration policies. I'm just as interested on the broader implications for other types of public policies, economic, social, foreign policy, including policies towards Europe. I think all of those are a big agenda, which is emerging quite nicely, but is still work in progress, as it were. Charles.
Thank you very much, Pippa. I'm
You're
afraid
welcome.
all good things must come to an end, as we all know, and we don't want to take up more of your time. Thank you so much for your presence here with us today.
Pleasure.
To listeners who haven't been able to be with us all the time, just let me reassure them that this will be available, the recording of this event will be available on the distance learning Spanish University website, UNED. And I just want to finish off by thanking Professor Gustavo Palomares and his team at UNED, my own team, of course, at Elcano, and in particular, Aitor Perez for helping us put this event together, and Carmen Gonzalez, and of course, Marga Gómez-Reino at UNED as well. And I look forward to seeing many of you in the course of the workshop during the next few days. So thank you so much, Pippa, for joining us. That was brilliant.
Thank you, and a real pleasure, Charles. And I hope next time we'll have more of a chance to have a coffee together rather than being at these distancing that we have.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Goodbye and good afternoon now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.
¿Qué tal? ¿Qué tal?
Ok, goodbye.
Hola.
Hasta luego, Juan.
Hasta luego.
Muchas gracias.
Bye bye.
Vosotros.
Hasta
Bueno.
mañana.
Hasta mañana.
Gracias.
Adiós. Gracias.
Hasta luego. Hasta luego. Gracias.
Chao, chao.
Adiós, Juan Ignacio.
Gracias. Rafael, muchísimas gracias por todo.